Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Have you ever sat silently while someone insulted you to your face, completely unaware that you held the exact power to destroy their entire life? If so, welcome, you are exactly who this story is for. Subscribe, because I promise you, the payoff is more satisfying than you can possibly imagine. My name is Elena Vance, I am 32 years old and I am a senior forensic auditor for the Federal Financial Crimes Division. It is a job that most people do not understand and one that I rarely explain in full. In my line of work, we do not carry weapons and we do not break down doors. We look at numbers, we look at the tiny invisible threads of money that connect offshore accounts to luxury real estate, and we trace them until the entire house of cards collapses. I have frozen accounts worth hundreds of millions of dollars with a single keystroke. I have watched billionaires weep in pristine conference rooms. But my husband's family did not know any of this. To them, I was just Mark's quiet wife. I was the woman who wore simple dresses, who spoke softly, and who supposedly worked some tedious, low-level accounting job for the government. They were old money, the kind of family that believed wealth was a personality trait and arrogance was a birthright. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, was a woman whose entire existence revolved around country club memberships and maintaining the illusion of absolute superiority. Her daughter, my sister-in-law Chloe, was a pristine replica of her mother, sharp-edged, fiercely entitled and deeply convinced that anyone outside her tax bracket was essentially a different species. I had known this about them for years. Mark and I had been married for 3 years, and in that time, I had mastered the art of becoming invisible in their presence. I let them dominate the conversations. I let Beatrice criticize my posture, my hair, and my choice of footwear. I smiled, I nodded, and I catalogued everything. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when the first real fracture appeared. Tuesday dinners were a strict requirement in the Vance family. Beatrice insisted on them. She claimed it was to keep the family close, but in reality, it was an audience for her to hold court. That particular Tuesday was meant to be a celebration. Chloe had just announced her engagement to Julian Sterling, the heir to the Sterling Group, a massive private equity firm, with holdings scattered across Europe and the Cayman Islands. The restaurant Beatrice had chosen for the occasion was the sort of place that did not print prices on the menu. The lighting was dim, the tablecloths were heavy linen, and the waiters moved with silent, practiced efficiency. I was wearing a simple navy dress. It was well made, but it lacked a designer label. I had purchased it specifically because it was unpretentious. But the moment I stepped into the private dining room, I saw Beatrice's eyes lock onto the fabric. Her gaze traveled from my neckline to my shoes, taking an agonizingly slow inventory of everything I lacked. "Elena," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with that specific brand of false warmth that old money perfects. "How brave of you to wear something so sensible to an occasion like this. It is quite charming." "In a rustic sort of way, thank you, Beatrice," I replied evenly. I did not justify my outfit. I did not explain that I had come straight from a 12-hour review of a shell company's ledger. I simply took my seat at the far end of the table, as far away from the center of attention as they preferred me to be. Mark was already deep in conversation with Julian, oblivious as usual to the subtle daggers his mother threw in my direction. Mark was not a bad man, but he was selectively blind. He loved his family and he had spent his entire life avoiding the jagged edges of their cruelty. He had long ago decided that the easiest path was to simply ignore it. I had accepted this flaw in him because honestly I did not need his protection. I had survived far worse predators than Beatrice Vance. Dinner progressed in the usual manner. The conversation flowed around me, skipping over my head like stones on a pond. They discussed Julian's upcoming business merger, a massive acquisition that the Sterling Group was finalizing. They discussed the wedding venue, a chateau in the south of France. They discussed the guest list, which apparently included half the European aristocracy. I drank my water, ate my salad, and observed, and then it happened. The waiters had just cleared the main courses. Chloe leaned across the table toward her mother, her eyes flicking briefly in my direction. She switched to French, her accent polished by years of expensive boarding schools in Switzerland. "Je ne peux pas croire qu'elle ait porté cette chose affreuse," Chloe murmured, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "Elle ressemble à une paysanne, c'est embarrassant de la voir assise à notre table." "I cannot believe she wore that awful thing. She looks like a peasant. It is embarrassing to have her sitting at our table." Beatrice laughed, a soft glittering sound that blended perfectly with the clinking of crystal glasses. She replied also in French, her tone casually vicious. "Ne t'inquiète pas, ma chérie. Cette vieille paysanne ne comprend pas un mot. Elle est probablement stupide. Do not worry, my darling, this old peasant doesn't understand a word. She is probably stupid. My hand resting on the stem of my water glass did not even twitch. My face remained a perfectly composed mask of polite indifference. I turned my head slightly, looking at the elaborate chandelier hanging above us, offering them the exact profile of ignorance they expected. They did not know that before I took the federal job in Washington, I had spent 8 years working in Paris. I had been an embedded forensic auditor for Interpol's Financial Crimes Unit. I had navigated rooms filled with international arms dealers, corrupt politicians, and cartel financiers. I had conducted interrogations entirely in French, parsing the most complex legal terminologies with native fluency. I understood the language better than they did. I understood the exact conjugations of their contempt. This old peasant doesn't understand a word. I let the sentence settle in my mind. It was a cold, precise moment of clarity. For years I had tolerated their microaggressions because it was easier than fighting a war over minor slights. But this was different. This was not a microaggression. This was a statement of profound, unadulterated disrespect spoken right to my face behind the coward's shield of a foreign language. I picked up my water glass, took a slow measured sip and set it down without making a sound. The sea base was excellent, I said to the table, speaking in perfect accentless English. Chloe smirked, exchanging a triumphant glance with her mother. They believed they had won. They believed their secret language had protected their cruelty. I sat there for the next 2 hours, smiling, nodding, and silently cataloging every single word they said. I filed away Beatrice's casual mentions of Julian's offshore account. I noted Chloe's bragging about the massive influx of capital the Sterling Group was about to receive. I memorized the names of the foreign investors they casually dropped into the conversation. What they did not know, what they could not possibly have known, was that the Sterling Group was not a stranger to me. In fact, their entire corporate profile had been sitting on my desk for the past 3 weeks. The Federal Financial Crimes Division had been quietly monitoring a series of highly suspicious wire transfers originating from the Cayman Islands and funneling into a web of shell companies associated with the Sterling Group. Julian Sterling's empire was not built on brilliant investments. It was built on a massive, highly illegal financial centrifuge designed to launder money for sanctioned entities. I had been assigned as the lead auditor on the file. Up until that dinner, I had been treating it as a standard investigation. I had been meticulous, objective, and emotionally detached. I was simply doing my job, following the numbers where they led. I had even considered recusing myself due to the family connection, though the link was tenuous at best. But sitting at that table, listening to them call me a stupid peasant in a language they thought I couldn't understand, the objectivity vanished. The cold, mechanical detachment of the federal auditor was replaced by something else. Something entirely different. Cold fury. It is a specific type of anger. It does not shout. It does not scream. It does not throw glasses or flip tables. Cold fury is silent. It is patient. It takes notes. It builds a meticulously documented case, and it waits for the absolute perfect moment to execute the trap. When the dinner finally ended, we stood on the sidewalk waiting for the valet to bring the cars. Chloe hugged Mark, ignoring me entirely. Beatrice offered me a stiff nod. Good night, Elena, Beatrice said in English, her tone patronizing. Do try to find something a bit more appropriate to wear for the engagement party next month. We will be taking professional photographs. I will definitely keep that in mind, Beatrice, I said, smiling a smile that did not reach my eyes. I look forward to it. Mark and I drove home in relative silence. He was humming along to the radio, completely unaware of the tectonic shift that had just occurred in his universe. Dinner was nice, wasn't it? Mark said as he pulled into our driveway. Julian seems like a great guy. Chloe's really happy. Yes, I replied softly, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. It was very revealing. I did not sleep that night. While Mark snored softly in the bedroom, I sat in the darkness of my home office, the blue light of my laptop illuminating the quiet room. I logged into the federal encrypted server. I opened the Sterling Group file. For the next 6 hours, I did not stop typing. I pulled tax records. I requested swift wire transfer logs from international banking partners. I cross-referenced Julian Sterling's personal expenditures with the corporate holdings of the shell companies Beatrice had so helpfully name-dropped during dessert. By the time the sun began to rise, turning the sky a pale, bruising purple, I had found it. The golden thread, the single undeniable link between Julian's upcoming $800 million merger and a sanctioned foreign entity. It was buried deep hidden behind 3 layers of corporate veils in jurisdictions that prided themselves on secrecy. But they had made a mistake. They had transferred a fraction of the funds through a domestic escrow account to cover the initial legal fees for the merger. An escrow account that fell squarely under federal jurisdiction. I printed the ledger, a satisfying hum emanating from the printer in the corner of the room. I picked up the warm sheet of paper and traced the numbers with my index finger. $800 million, that was the exact amount of capital Julian needed to secure his empire. That was the exact amount of money Chloe and Beatrice were banking on to elevate their social status to the stratosphere. And it was exactly the amount of money I was going to freeze. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of plain black tea, and watched the morning light filter through the blinds. I was not going to act immediately, that would be too easy. If I dropped the hammer now, they would have time to recover, time to scramble, time to hide their assets. No, I was going to wait. I was going to let them plan their $2 million wedding. I was going to let them buy their designer gowns, book their private jets, and bask in their delusion of untouchable grandeur. I was going to let them climb as high as they possibly could. Because the higher they climbed, the more devastating the fall would be. This old peasant understood every word, and I was going to make sure they never forgot it. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in psychological endurance. To the outside world, my life remained remarkably unchanged. I continued my routine. I woke up at 5:30 every morning, drank my plain black tea, and took the train into the city, blending in with the thousands of other federal employees navigating the concrete canyons of Washington, D.C. I wore my sensible shoes and my unbranded coats, carrying myself with the quiet anonymity that my profession demanded. But beneath that placid surface, a massive, highly classified federal investigation was quietly gaining momentum, entirely fueled by the arrogance of the people who believed I was nothing. The Vance family, meanwhile, was in a state of absolute feverish euphoria. Chloe's upcoming wedding to Julian Sterling had become the singular focus of their existence. It was no longer just a celebration of marriage, it was a coronation. Beatrice treated the event as a strategic military campaign designed to conquer the upper echelons of high society. The budget, initially set at a staggering $500,000, had rapidly ballooned to over $2 million. There were custom-designed silk pavilions being imported from Italy, rare orchids being flown in from Southeast Asia, and a guest list that read like the attendee roster of the World Economic Forum. And through it all, I was dragged along as an unwilling prop in their theatrical display of wealth. Mark, operating under the delusion that his family actually want my presence, insisted we attend every pre-wedding event. The engagement party, the bridal shower, the weekend brunches, I was present for all of them. I became a silent, unassuming fixture in their glittering world, holding a glass of sparkling water, observing and memorizing every single detail. The first of these events was a Sunday brunch at the country club, 2 weeks after the dinner where they had first spoken French in front of me. The club was a sprawling, aggressively manicured estate that catered strictly to old money. The air smelled of expensive perfume and the quiet desperation of people trying to prove they belonged. We were seated on the terrace overlooking the 18th hole. The table was crowded with Chloe's friends, a flock of sharp-featured women wearing oversized sunglasses and casually carrying handbags worth more than the average American's annual salary. Beatrice sat at the head of the table holding court. I was placed at the very end, wedged between a potted fern and Chloe's third cousin, who spent the first 20 minutes of the brunch pointedly ignoring me in favor of her phone. I didn't mind, I preferred the silence, it allowed me to work. My mind was not on the mimosa in front of me or the artisanal pastries being passed around the table. My mind was on the Sterling Group ledger I had spent the previous night dissecting. I had spent hours tracing a series of phantom transactions, money moved from a shell corporation in Cyprus to a holding company in Delaware, and then quietly funneled into Julian's personal escrow account. It was a classic layering technique designed to obscure the origin of the funds before the massive $800 million merger was finalized. The arrogance of the method was staggering. Julian was relying on the sheer volume of the transaction to hide the illicit funds, assuming federal auditors wouldn't have the time or resources to peel back the layers. He was wrong. I had the time. I had all the time in the world. Alina, Beatrice's voice sliced through my thoughts, loud enough to ensure the entire table was listening. I noticed you didn't RSVP to the spa weekend Chloe is hosting in Aspen next month. Surely you aren't planning to miss it? It is a crucial bonding experience for the bridal party. I placed my fork down precisely on the edge of my plate. I'm afraid I won't be able to make it, Beatrice. I have some pressing deadlines at work that weekend. Chloe let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. She leaned back in her chair, twirling a piece of celery from her Bloody Mary. Deadlines at a government accounting job. What exactly are you doing, Elena? Auditing paperclips? I can't imagine anything you do is so important that it can't be pushed back for a weekend in Aspen. A few of her friends snickered softly. Mark, seated halfway down the table, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. He focused intently on cutting his eggs Benedict, exercising his lifelong talent for avoiding conflict. My work requires a certain level of continuous attention, I replied smoothly, my voice devoid of any defensive edge. It's tedious, I admit, but it must be done, Beatrice sighed theatrically, turning to the woman seated next to her. She switched smoothly into French, the transition so natural it seemed rehearsed. C'est toujours la même chose avec elle, Beatrice murmured, her tone dripping with disdain. Elle s'accroche à ce petit travail minable parce qu'elle sait qu'elle n'a rien d'autre. Elle n'a aucune classe. Je me demande parfois pourquoi Marc l'a épousée. Elle est tellement ennuyeuse. It is always the same thing with her. She clings to this petty, pathetic little job because she knows she has nothing else. She has no class. I sometimes wonder why Marc married her. She is so boring, Chloe chimed in, her French quicker, more biting. Elle gâche nos photos, maman, regarde-la. Elle ressemble à une bibliothécaire de province. C'est une honte pour notre famille. She ruins our photos, Mom, look at her. She looks like a provincial librarian. She is a disgrace to our family. My expression did not change, not a muscle twitched. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. A provincial librarian, it was almost comical how spectacularly wrong they were. If they only knew the sheer magnitude of the power resting in the hands of this provincial librarian, they would have choked on their mimosas. I looked at Chloe, admiring the 3-carat diamond resting on her finger. A diamond paid for, I now knew, by funds illegally wired through a sanctioned entity in Eastern Europe. The irony was exquisite. She was sitting there, calling me a disgrace, while wearing a felony on her left hand. Are the mimosas good? I asked Chloe in English, offering a polite vacant smile. You seem to be enjoying them. Chloe rolled her eyes, switching back to English with obvious reluctance. They are fine, Elena, just fine, I nodded, returning my attention to the view of the golf course. Let them talk, I thought. Let them mock my clothes, my job, my background. Every insult they hurled in French was another brick in the absolute fortress of a case I was building against them. The investigation at the federal level was moving rapidly. Because of the sheer scale of the $800 million merger, the Department of Justice had flagged the Sterling Group file for expedited review. As the lead forensic auditor, I held the reins. I was coordinating with analysts in 3 different time zones, cross-referencing Julian Sterling's domestic accounts with Interpol's database of known money laundering nodes. What I discovered over the next 2 weeks was not just a case of minor tax evasion. It was a structural rot. The Sterling Group was essentially acting as a massive laundromat for illicit funds, cleaning the money through complex real estate acquisitions and private equity mergers. The $800 million deal they were currently celebrating was the crown jewel of their operation, a massive infusion of capital that would legitimize their stolen wealth forever. And Beatrice Vance, my charming mother-in-law, was not just an innocent bystander. During a deep dive into the holding companies associated with the merger, I found a familiar name buried in the corporate registry of a shell company based in the British Virgin Islands. Beatrice Vance was listed as a silent partner, holding a significant equity stake. She was not just marrying her daughter off to a billionaire, she was actively participating in the financial windfall. The realization hit me while I was sitting alone in my office, the glow of the dual monitors reflecting in the dark window overlooking the city. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Beatrice was involved. She had leveraged the Vance family's connections to facilitate introductions for Julian, taking a quiet cut of the illicit funds in exchange. It explained the sudden, massive expansion of the wedding budget. It explained Beatrice's frantic, obsessive need to impress Julian's investors at every social gathering. She wasn't just throwing a party, she was performing for her financial benefactors. The sheer audacity of it left me breathless. They were committing massive federal crimes, and then spending their weekends drinking expensive champagne, and calling me a stupid peasant in a language they assumed I couldn't comprehend. The disconnect between their perceived reality and their actual vulnerability was staggering. They were dancing on the edge of a sheer cliff, completely blind to the fact that I was the one holding the explosive detonator. 3 days later, I attended the bridal shower. It was held at a boutique hotel downtown. A dizzying display of pastel macarons, crystal chandeliers, and forced laughter. I stood near the back of the room holding a cup of plain black tea, watching Chloe unwrap gifts that cost more than my first car. "Alina, darling," Beatrice approached me, a glass of champagne in her hand. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my simple gray blazer. "You are standing in the shadows again, you really must try to mingle. It reflects poorly on Mark when his wife behaves like the hired help." "I'm just observing, Beatrice," I said quietly. "It's a beautiful shower, yes, well, it takes effort to produce something beautiful," Beatrice said, her voice tightening. She leaned in closer, dropping her voice. "And speaking of effort, I expect you to contribute to the floral arrangements for the rehearsal dinner. The bill is quite substantial, and as family you and Mark must do your part. I will send you the invoice, it's $50,000, I looked at her, my face perfectly blank. $50,000, it was an absurd demand designed solely to humiliate me, to put me in my place, to remind me of the vast financial chasm that separated us. "I don't think that will be possible, Beatrice," I said, my voice steady, betraying no emotion. "That is outside our budget." Beatrice's eyes flashed with genuine anger, the polite facade slipped, revealing the ugly, grasping entitlement underneath. She stepped back, turning to Chloe, who had just walked over to join us. Beatrice switched to French, her voice a harsh, angry hiss. "C'est une honte absolue, elle refuse de payer, elle est inutile, une sanction sur notre famille. Elle ne mérite pas d'être ici, it is absolute disgrace, she refuses to pay, she is useless. A leech on our family, she doesn't deserve to be here," Chloe sneered, looking right at me. "Elle est pathétique, laisse tomber, maman. On ne peut pas attendre d'un cochon qu'il apprécie les perles." "She is pathetic, let it go, Mom, you cannot expect a pig to appreciate pearls, a pig." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and foul. It was the exact word that had started this entire cascade. They had looked at a federal investigator, a woman holding the absolute power to dismantle their entire existence, and they had called her a pig. I did not flinch, I did not argue, I did not tell them that I spoke French, I simply smiled. A slow, chilling smile that did not reach my eyes. "I hope the flowers are beautiful, Beatrice," I said in English, my voice perfectly calm. "I am sure they will be unforgettable." I turned and walked away, leaving them standing there, secure in their arrogance, entirely unaware that the ground beneath their feet had just turned to ash. I left the bridal shower early. I took a cab back to my office. I sat down at my desk, logged into the secure federal network, and finalized the Sterling Group audit report. I checked the box recommending immediate asset freezing pending a grand jury indictment. I attached the SWIFT transfer logs, the shell company registries, and the direct links to Beatrice Vance's offshore equity stake. I hit submit. The wheels of the federal government are notoriously slow, but when a case involves $800 million of illicit funds tied to sanctioned entities, those wheels suddenly spin with terrifying velocity. I knew the timeline, I knew exactly how long it would take for the Department of Justice to secure the warrants. It would take exactly 10 days. 10 days, that was exactly 1 day before Chloe Vance was scheduled to marry Julian Sterling in a $2 million ceremony at a chateau in France. The trap was set, the door was locked, all I had to do now was wait for the walls to close in. The 10 days leading up to the wedding were a study in extreme contrasts. For the Vance family, it was a frenzied blur of final fittings, luxury travel arrangements, and frantic social climbing. For me, it was a period of absolute icy calm. I had set the wheels in motion, the Department of Justice had received my final audit report, and the federal machinery was quietly churning in the background, preparing a series of indictments and asset seizures that would shake the financial foundations of both the Sterling Group and the Vance family. I did not tell Mark. I debated it countless times, sitting in our living room while he enthusiastically packed his designer suits. Mark was a good man, but his blind loyalty to his mother and sister was his fatal flaw. If I told him, he would panic, he would try to warn them, and if he warned them, they would have a small, crucial window to move the funds, to liquidate the offshore accounts, and to flee the jurisdiction. I could not risk the entire investigation for the sake of his misplaced family loyalty. He had chosen to remain blind to their cruelty for years, now he would have to face the consequences of that blindness. We flew to France 5 days before the wedding. Beatrice had arranged for a private jet, courtesy of Julian Sterling's supposedly boundless wealth. The interior of the plane was a masterclass in aggressive opulence: white leather seats, gold-plated fixtures, and a flight attendant pouring vintage champagne before we even reached cruising altitude. I sat in the back of the cabin wearing a simple pair of slacks and a cashmere sweater, reading a novel while the rest of the family celebrated their impending ascension to the billionaire class. "Alina, darling," Beatrice called out from the front of the cabin, her voice carrying over the hum of the engines. "Do try to look a little more excited. You are flying on a private jet to a chateau in the south of France. It is a far cry from whatever dreary little office you usually spend your days in." "It is a lovely plane, Beatrice," I said calmly, turning a page of my book. Chloe laughed, leaning her head on Julian's shoulder. She switched to French, her voice a cruel purr. "Elle est tellement hors de son élément. Elle ressemble à une femme de chambre qui a gagné à la loterie, mais qui ne sait pas comment s'habiller. She is so out of her element, she looks like a maid who won the lottery but doesn't know how to dress." Julian chuckled, a low, arrogant sound. He did not speak French natively, but he understood enough to catch the insult. Beatrice smiled, raising her champagne glass in a silent toast to her daughter's viciousness. A maid who won the lottery. I kept my eyes on my book, but my mind was miles away, tracking the digital coordinates of Julian's escrow accounts. As they drank their champagne, I was mentally reviewing the exact sequence of federal warrants that were currently sitting on a judge's desk in Washington, D.C. The disconnect was exhilarating. They were so utterly convinced of their invulnerability, so completely blinded by their own arrogance, that they could not see the massive federal axe swinging directly toward their necks. We arrived at the chateau the next morning. It was a sprawling, breathtaking estate surrounded by vineyards, a monument to centuries of inherited wealth. The entire property had been rented out for the week, filled with Julian's business associates, elite investors, and the cream of European society. For the next 4 days, I was subjected to a relentless campaign of marginalization. Beatrice ensured that my room was in the farthest wing of the chateau, a small, drafty servants' quarter that overlooked the delivery entrance. Chloe deliberately left me off the schedule for the bridal spa day, claiming it was a simple oversight, though her smirk suggested otherwise. At dinners, I was seated at the extreme end of the table, usually next to elderly relatives or low-level employees of the Sterling Group who had no interest in speaking to me. Through it all, I maintained my absolute terrifying calm. I drank my plain tea. I spoke only when spoken to, and I absorbed every insult, every slight and every whispered French insult with the stoicism of a monk. "Elle est comme un meuble," Beatrice muttered one evening during a cocktail reception on the terrace. "Elle ne fait rien, elle ne dit rien. C'est gênant de la présenter aux investisseurs de Julien. She is like a piece of furniture, she does nothing, she says nothing. It is embarrassing to introduce her to Julian's investors." "Lasla," Chloe replied, waving a manicured hand. "Elle sera bientôt hors de nos vies. Une fois que je serai mariée, nous n'aurons plus jamais à l'inviter." "Leave her be. She will be out of our lives soon. Once I am married, we will never have to invite her again." I stood less than 10 feet away, admiring a 17th-century tapestry, listening to them casually discuss cutting me out of the family entirely. It was a confirming moment. Any lingering guilt I might have felt about keeping Mark in the dark, any small persistent voice that wondered if I was taking things too far, was instantly extinguished. They did not view me as human, they viewed me as a nuisance, a stain on their pristine social fabric. They were about to learn exactly how much power a piece of furniture could wield. The rehearsal dinner took place the night before the wedding. It was a lavish affair held in the chateau's grand ballroom, attended by over 200 guests. The room was a sea of bespoke tuxedos and haute couture gowns. The floral arrangements, the same ones Beatrice had demanded I pay for, cascaded from the ceiling in massive waves of white roses and orchids. Julian stood at the front of the room, raising a glass to toast his impending marriage. He spoke expansively about his business successes, the bright future of the Sterling Group, and the massive $800 million merger that was scheduled to finalize the following week. He thanked his investors, many of whom were sitting in the front row, their faces shining with greed and anticipation. "This weekend is not just about a wedding," Julian announced, his voice echoing through the ballroom. "It is about the union of two great families and the birth of an absolute financial powerhouse. The Sterling Group is poised to dominate the market, and I want to thank every single one of you for your unwavering support." The room erupted in applause. Beatrice was weeping delicate, photogenic tears. Chloe was beaming, looking like a queen surveying her newly conquered kingdom. I stood in the back of the room near the doors, my phone buzzing softly in my pocket. I slipped out of the ballroom and walked down a quiet stone corridor. I pulled out my phone and checked the encrypted messaging app I used for federal communications. The message was brief, sent from my section chief in Washington. Warrant signed, DOJ has initiated the freeze, Interpol coordinating for morning apprehension. Good work, Vance. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of finality wash over me. It was done. The $800 million had just been locked down by the federal government. The accounts were frozen, the merger was dead. The Sterling Group was officially a target of a massive international criminal investigation. And Julian Sterling, the arrogant billionaire currently toasting his own brilliance in the next room, was completely ruined. I walked back into the ballroom, the toasts had concluded and the guests were mingling, drinking expensive wine and laughing. I found Mark standing near the bar looking slightly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the event. "Everything okay?" he asked, noticing my expression. "Everything is perfectly fine, Mark," I said softly. "I just needed some air." Beatrice materialized beside us, her face flushed with champagne and triumph. "Elena," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I hope you are taking notes. This is how true success looks. This is what it means to be part of an elite circle. It must be quite overwhelming for someone from your background." She didn't even bother switching to French this time. The insult was delivered in plain English, a direct, unfiltered display of her arrogance. She was riding so high on the adrenaline of the evening that she felt completely untouchable. "It is certainly educational, Beatrice," I replied, my voice steady, my eyes locking onto hers. "I have learned a great deal this evening," she scoffed, turning her back on me to greet a wealthy French investor. Chloe walked past a moment later, intentionally bumping her shoulder against mine without a word of apology, her eyes fixed on the glittering crowd. They were terrible people, they were greedy, superficial, and fundamentally cruel. But in 12 hours they were going to lose absolutely everything. I slept soundly that night in my drafty little servant's quarter. I did not toss and turn, I did not worry about the fallout. I had done my job, I had followed the numbers, and I had executed my duty with the cold precision of a scalpel. The next morning broke clear and bright, the French sun illuminating the vineyards in a wash of golden light. It was the morning of the wedding. The chateau was buzzing with frantic energy. Caterers were setting up the massive outdoor reception area, florists were adjusting the displays, and the string quartet was warming up on the terrace. I dressed carefully. I bypassed the simple navy dresses and the gray blazers. Instead, I put on a tailored crimson suit I had purchased years ago in Paris. It was sharp, elegant, and unapologetic. It was the armor of a woman who was no longer pretending to be invisible. I walked downstairs to the grand foyer, where the family was gathered for pre-wedding photographs. Chloe was standing in the center of the room, wearing a custom-designed gown that cost more than most people's homes. She looked beautiful and she looked incredibly, dangerously arrogant. Beatrice was fussing with Chloe's veil, barking orders at the photographers in broken French. Non, the lighting is terrible here," Beatrice snapped, waving her hands. "Move the lights, quickly." I stood by the doorway watching them. Mark was adjusting his tie in a mirror, oblivious to the storm that was gathering just outside the heavy oak doors of the chateau. Through the massive front windows I saw them, 3 sleek, unmarked black sedans were driving slowly up the long gravel driveway. They moved with a synchronized predatory grace, cutting through the picturesque scenery like a blade. I checked my watch, 10 a.m. right on schedule. The sedans parked directly in front of the chateau's main entrance. The doors opened and a dozen men and women in dark suits stepped out. Several of them were wearing jackets with the distinctive insignia of the French Police Nationale, accompanied by 2 federal agents from the U.S. Department of Justice. The photographers stopped taking pictures. Beatrice froze, her hands still clutching Chloe's veil. The entire room fell into a stunned absolute silence. The lead agent, a tall, severe-looking Frenchman, walked up the steps and pushed open the heavy oak doors. He scanned the room, his eyes sweeping over the bewildered guests and the frantic family members. "Julian Sterling?" the agent asked, his voice ringing out in heavily accented English. Julian stepped forward, his face pale, his usual arrogance entirely evaporated. "I am Julian Sterling. Who are you? What is the meaning of this?" "I am Inspector Laurent with the Financial Crimes Division," the agent said smoothly. "And we are here to execute a federal warrant for your arrest, as well as the immediate seizure of all assets associated with the Sterling Group, pending charges of international money laundering and wire fraud." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The silence in the room was deafening. It was the sound of an empire collapsing in real time. The sheer velocity with which a life can disintegrate is truly something to behold. One moment Julian Sterling was the golden boy of global finance, a billionaire standing in the grand foyer of a French chateau, preparing to marry into a family that worshipped his bank accounts. The next moment, he was a target, cornered by federal agents and staring down the barrel of international criminal indictments. The silence in the room stretched, taut and fragile, until Beatrice finally shattered it. "This is absurd," Beatrice screeched, pushing past the photographer to step in front of Julian. She turned her furious gaze upon the French inspector, her face flushed with indignant rage. She assumed her usual tactic, the aggressive deployment of her social status. "Do you have any idea who we are? You are ruining my daughter's wedding. Get out of this chateau immediately before I have your jobs." Inspector Laurent did not even blink. He looked at Beatrice with the tired, indifferent expression of a man who had arrested politicians, cartel bosses and oligarchs. He was unimpressed by her country club membership. "Madame, step aside," Laurent said, his voice flat. "This is a federal matter. No, I will not step aside." Beatrice yelled, her voice echoing off the marble walls. She turned to Chloe, who was standing frozen, clutching her $2 million dress as if it were a shield. Beatrice then switched to French, assuming, as she always did, that it would give her an edge, a way to intimidate the local authorities, or perhaps negotiate her way out of the disaster. "Vous êtes des idiots incompétents," Beatrice shouted in French, waving a manicured finger in the inspector's face. "Vous n'avez aucune autorité ici. Julien est un citoyen américain et sa société pèse des milliards. Vous allez tous être licenciés pour cette erreur ridicule. You are incompetent idiots, you have no authority here. Julian is an American citizen and his company is worth billions. You are all going to be fired for this ridiculous mistake." Laurent looked at her, his expression hardening. He was losing patience. "Madame, je vous préviens de reculer, nous exécutons un mandat international. Ne rendez pas cela plus difficile." "Madam, I am warning you to step back, we are executing an international warrant. Do not make this more difficult, I demand to speak to your superior." Beatrice screamed, reverting to English. "I want an American official. I want someone who understands how things actually work." One of the DOJ agents stepped forward, a stern-faced woman holding a thick manila folder. "Ma'am, I am with the United States Department of Justice. We have been tracking the Sterling Group's financial activities for over 18 months. The $800 million merger has been flagged for massive irregularities involving sanctioned entities. The funds have been frozen, the accounts are locked. Mr. Sterling is coming with us." Julian opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The arrogance had entirely drained from his face, leaving only a pale, terrified shell. He looked like a man who had just realized the parachute he was wearing was actually an anvil. "This is impossible," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. She looked around the room, her eyes darting between the agents and the stunned wedding guests. "Julian, tell them they're wrong, tell them it's a mistake." Julian did not look at her. He looked at the floor. That silence was all the confirmation she needed. There must be some mistake. Beatrice insisted, her voice shrill, bordering on hysterical. She turned to Mark, who was standing near the staircase, looking completely bewildered. "Mark, do something, call our lawyers." "Call someone." Mark took a hesitant step forward, but before he could speak, I stepped out from the shadows near the doorway. My crimson suit stark against the pale marble of the foyer. "Mark doesn't need to call anyone, Beatrice," I said calmly, my voice projecting clearly across the chaotic room. Every eye in the foyer turned to me. Beatrice glared, her face contorted with a mixture of confusion and raw fury. "Elena, shut up and stay out of this." Beatrice hissed. "You have absolutely no idea what is going on here. Go back to your room." "On the contrary, Beatrice," I said, walking slowly into the center of the room, stopping halfway between the terrified family and the line of federal agents. "I know exactly what is going on here." I turned to Inspector Laurent and the DOJ agents. I offered a polite, professional nod. "Inspector Laurent," I said, speaking in flawless, accentless French. "C'est un plaisir de vous revoir. Cela fait plusieurs années depuis l'affaire de blanchiment à Lyon. Je vois que vous êtes toujours aussi ponctuel, Inspector Laurent. It is a pleasure to see you again. It has been several years since the laundering case in Lyon. I see you are still as punctual as ever." Laurent's eyes widened slightly in recognition. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. Agent Vance, j'aurais dû me douter ce dossier impeccable venait de vous. Votre travail est toujours d'une précision chirurgicale. Agent Vance, I should have suspected this flawless file came from you. Your work is always surgically precise, I nodded, acknowledging the compliment before turning my attention back to the Vance family. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a profound, suffocating silence. Beatrice was staring at me, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with a sudden dawning terror. Chloe had dropped her bouquet. The white orchids hit the marble floor with a soft, pathetic thud. Mark looked as though he had just watched a ghost materialize in the center of the room. You speak French?" Chloe stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Perfectly, I replied, switching back to English. My voice was smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of mercy. I spent 8 years in Paris, working as an embedded forensic auditor for Interpol's Financial Crimes Unit. I specialize in international money laundering and the dismantling of offshore corporate structures. I took another step closer to Beatrice, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. So yes, Beatrice, I continued, holding her panicked gaze. I understood every single word you said at that engagement dinner. I understood every insult you hurled at me during the brunch at the country club. I understood exactly what you meant when you called me a provincial librarian and a worthless peasant. Beatrice's face drained of color. She looked as though the oxygen had been forcibly extracted from her lungs. She tried to speak, but only a small choked gasp escaped her throat. You thought my job was tedious, I said, my tone casual, conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. You thought I audited paperclips for the government. You were wrong. My job is to find the invisible threads of stolen money and pull them until the entire sweater unravels. And the Sterling Group file, the massive $800 million merger you have been bragging about for the past month. I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment crush them. I am the lead auditor on that file, I stated clearly. I am the one who traced the phantom transactions from Cyprus. I am the one who identified the layering techniques through the Delaware holding companies. I am the one who compiled the evidence, secured the federal warrants, and submitted the final report to the Department of Justice. I looked at Julian, who was currently being handcuffed by a French officer. And I am the one who just froze every single cent of that $800 million. Chloe let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She lunged forward, her pristine white gown dragging across the floor, but Mark grabbed her arm, pulling her back. You did this? Chloe shrieked, her face twisted with a level of hatred I had rarely seen outside of an interrogation room. You destroyed my wedding? You ruined my life over a dress. No, Chloe, I said, my voice hardening, the cold fury finally bleeding into my tone. I did not ruin your life over a dress. I ruined your life because your fiancé is a global criminal who launders money for sanctioned entities. The fact that you are a vicious, entitled brat who insults people in a language you assume they cannot understand. That was just the motivation I needed to expedite the paperwork. I turned my gaze back to Beatrice, who was swaying slightly on her feet, clutching the edge of a mahogany console table for support. Oh, and Beatrice, I added, my voice dropping to a low, quiet register that carried perfectly across the silent room. I also traced the equity stake in the British Virgin Islands Shell Corporation. The one listed under your name, the one you were using to take a quiet cut of the illicit funds. Beatrice's eyes rolled back, and for a brief, hilarious moment I thought she was actually going to faint. She didn't, she just stood there, paralyzed by the realization that her entire carefully constructed life of elite privilege had just been vaporized. The DOJ has already initiated the asset seizure protocols, I informed her calmly. Your bank accounts in the United States have been frozen. The country club memberships, the luxury cars, the massive estate, all of it is currently under federal lock and key pending the grand jury indictment. The absolute devastation in the room was palpable. It was a complete structural collapse of the Vance family's reality. They had spent years treating me like an inferior species, completely blind to the fact that they were swimming in a shark tank, and they had just been casually insulting the apex predator. Elena, please, Mark finally spoke, his voice trembling, his eyes pleading. Tell me this isn't real, tell me this is some kind of mistake. My mother, Chloe, they didn't know what Julian was doing. They couldn't have. I looked at Mark, the man I had married. I felt a brief passing shadow of pity for him. He had spent his entire life avoiding conflict, ignoring the cruelty of his family, choosing the path of least resistance. Now that path had led him directly over a cliff, Beatrice knew exactly what she was doing. Mark, I said softly but firm. She signed the equity agreements, she actively participated in the financial structuring. She traded her daughter to a criminal in exchange for a piece of the pie. It is all documented, it is all undeniable. Mark stared at his mother, the reality of the situation finally shattering his lifelong illusion. Beatrice could not meet his eyes, she looked away, her face a mask of shame and terror. The DOJ agent stepped forward again, looking directly at Beatrice. Mrs. Vance, we will need you to surrender your passport. You are considered a flight risk. You will be transported back to the United States on a federal transport plane to face formal charges. Beatrice let out a long shuddering wail. It was an ugly guttural sound, stripped of all her usual refinement and class. It was the sound of a woman realizing that there were no managers to complain to, no checks she could write, and no social connections she could leverage to escape the consequences of her own actions. You planned this, Chloe sobbed, sinking to her knees on the marble floor, her beautiful dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. You sat there for weeks and let us plan the wedding. You let us invite everyone, you planned this whole thing just to humiliate us. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No guilt, no remorse, only the cold, precise satisfaction of a ledger that had finally been perfectly balanced. I didn't plan your wedding, Chloe, I said smoothly. I just audited the budget and it turns out you couldn't afford it. I did not stay to watch them drag Julian away in handcuffs, though I am sure it was a spectacular sight. I did not stay to listen to Beatrice beg for leniency or watch Chloe weep over the ruined remains of her $2 million wedding. There was no need, the trap had been sprung, the cage was locked, the outcome was entirely inevitable. I turned my back on the chaos in the grand foyer, the screams of the disgraced socialites fading into the background, and I walked out the heavy oak doors of the chateau. The French morning air was crisp, carrying the faint sweet scent of the surrounding vineyards. It was a beautiful day. I walked down the gravel driveway, my crimson suit bright against the manicured green lawns. I did not hurry, I did not run, I walked with the slow measured pace of a woman who had just successfully executed a surgical strike against an empire of absolute arrogance. A black sedan was waiting for me at the end of the driveway, arranged by the Department of Justice for my immediate transport back to the airport. The driver, a quiet man in a dark suit, held the door open for me. Everything concludes satisfactorily, Agent Vance? He asked, his voice respectful. Perfectly, I replied, sliding into the back seat. As the car pulled away, driving down the winding road that led away from the chateau, I looked out the window. I could see the massive estate shrinking in the distance, a monument to greed and entitlement that was currently being dismantled brick by brick. It was a satisfying image, one that I would carry with me for a very long time. The aftermath was exactly as catastrophic as I had predicted. The news of the $800 million freeze and Julian Sterling's arrest broke internationally before my flight even touched down in Washington, D.C. It dominated the financial news cycles for weeks. The Sterling Group, stripped of its capital and exposed to the harsh light of a massive federal investigation, collapsed almost instantly. The offshore accounts were seized, the shell companies were dissolved, and the entire corporate structure was systematically dismantled by the Department of Justice. Beatrice Vance was formally indicted for her role in the money laundering operation. The federal prosecutors were not lenient. They presented the evidence, the equity agreements, the wire transfer logs, the offshore registries, and they dismantled her defense with ruthless efficiency. The Vance family's assets, the sprawling estate, the luxury cars, the country club memberships, were all seized by the government under federal forfeiture laws. Beatrice, the woman who had spent her entire life looking down on everyone else, was suddenly reduced to a federal defendant, stripped of her wealth and her status, facing a very real, very lengthy prison sentence. Chloe, left with nothing but a cancelled wedding and a disgraced name, tried to distance herself from the fallout. She gave tearful interviews claiming ignorance, insisting that she was just a victim of Julian's deception. But the social circles she had fought so hard to conquer quickly turned their backs on her. In the world of old money, bankruptcy and federal indictments are highly contagious diseases. She became a pariah overnight, entirely isolated and profoundly alone. As for Mark, our marriage ended quietly, cleanly, and without much fanfare. He could not look at me without seeing the architect of his family's destruction. He could not accept that the destruction was entirely of their own making. I did not fight the divorce. I signed the papers, packed my things, and walked away. Mark had spent his life avoiding the truth about his family, and in the end that avoidance had cost him everything. I did not hate him, but I did not pity him either. I returned to my life in Washington. I went back to my desk, back to my dual monitors, and back to the meticulous invisible work of tracking stolen money. I continued to wear my simple clothes and I continued to drink my plain black tea. To the outside world, I was still just a quiet federal employee. But I knew the truth, I knew exactly what I was capable of. People often ask me, in the rare moments when I choose to share this story, why I didn't say anything sooner. Why I sat through the dinners, the brunches, the endless barrage of insults without defending myself. Why I let them call me a stupid peasant, a provincial librarian, a pig, without ever raising my voice or revealing that I understood every single word they said. They ask how I could possess that much power and still choose to remain silent. The answer is simple: silence is not weakness, silence is not surrender, silence is the most terrifying weapon you can possibly wield against someone who mistakes your quietness for ignorance. When you shout, you reveal your position; when you argue, you lower yourself to their level. You engage in a battle of egos, fighting over scraps of respect from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it. But when you stay silent, you become a ghost, you become a mirror, reflecting their arrogance back at them while you quietly, methodically, and ruthlessly dismantle the foundation of their entire existence. Beatrice and Chloe Vance believed that their wealth made them untouchable. They believed that their ability to speak a foreign language gave them a secret shield to hurl insults without consequence. They were so blinded by their own entitlement that they failed to realize the basic, fundamental rule of power. True power does not need to announce itself. True power does not need to brag at country club brunches or scream in the foyers of French chateaus. True power simply sits at the end of the table, sipping plain tea, listening, cataloging, and waiting for the absolute perfect moment to strike. If you are listening to this and you have ever found yourself sitting at a table with people who underestimate you, people who belittle your career, mock your clothes, or assume you are too simple to understand the game they are playing, do not argue with them. Do not try to prove your worth to people who are determined to misunderstand you. Let them talk, let them laugh, let them build their fragile empires on the assumption that you are nothing. Take notes, build your case, focus on your own growth, your own skills, your own silent, unstoppable momentum, because the day will come when the bill is due. The day will come when the fragile illusion of their superiority shatters against the hard, unforgiving reality of your competence. And when that day comes, you will not need to raise your voice. You will not need to shout or scream or demand an apology. You will simply drop the evidence on the table, watch the realization drain the color from their faces, and walk away. I walked away from the Vance family without a backward glance. I left them in the ruins of their own making, fully aware that they would never, for the rest of their lives, look at a quiet woman in a simple dress without wondering exactly how much power she was hiding. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment and let your success be your revenge, hit the like button, share this with someone who needs a reminder that their silence is a weapon. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about people who learned the hard way that you should never, ever mistake kindness for weakness. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one holding the match that will burn the entire house to the ground.